Today, Joan Crawford is perhaps best known for her sins as a mother, but there is so much more to the star who became the subject of Mommie Dearest. Today, we are covering the roller coaster of her life while creating this inspired makeup look. Let's dive in. Joan Crawford was born Lucille Fay LeSueur in San Antonio, Texas on March 23rd in 1904. No one's really sure because she would often lie about her age to seem younger because, as we all know, Hollywood has a very big problem with women daring to age. What we do know for sure is that Joan was an Aries, and boy, was Joan ever an Aries. Strong-willed, independent, challenging. Joan definitely fit the bill of a stereotypical Aries. Joan's father, Tom, was a contractor, but he abandoned Joan and her mother Anna and Joan's older brother Hal shortly after Joan was born. So Anna moved herself and the children to Lawton, Oklahoma, where she would later marry the owner of a local opera house. His name was Henry Casson. Joan grew up with Henry as her father, and it wasn't until she was about 11 years old that she actually found out he was not her biological father. Growing up, Joan was known as Billy Casson, and she loved to perform. She would spend so much time in the opera house, like backstage in the wings, watching the performances, and she really started to just love performance. She would put on little shows for like local children. She was really invested in becoming a performer from a young age. But at that time, she was at a huge disadvantage because most of the people who really made it big, they had, parents that could pay for dance lessons and singing lessons. And Joan didn't really have anyone to provide those things for her. So she kind of had to pick up what she could backstage watching these performances at the opera house. Joan's childhood was incredibly difficult. She was often teased at school because she had homemade clothes. Her family didn't have a lot of money. And when she was about 12 years old, her family had to move to Kansas City because her adopted father, Henry, was suspected of embezzling money, which he was probably guilty of based on the fact that at one point, Joan found like a small fortune of gold, like actual gold, in their basement. Joan also had a pretty tense relationship with her mother, Anna. Anna would often compare Joan to Hal. So she'd be like, oh, why can't you be like Hal? Hal is so good. He's the good one. And, that's really awful to be compared to your siblings. I don't think anyone likes being compared to their siblings, especially by your parents. I don't think my parents have ever compared me to my siblings. Thank God, because that would just be terrible. You just don't compare your children. It's not cool. Things get much worse in Joan's home life when Henry begins molesting Joan, which just makes me honestly so angry. When this topic comes up in Beauty Biography, I get really upset and I get heated and I want to say really terrible things and I want to go spit on people's graves because I just if you hurt children, I think you are awful. I love everybody and I feel like I'm a really nice person unless you hurt children. See, it's happening. I'm thinking of all the things that I would do to someone if they hurt a child. I just really hate people who abuse children. It is not okay. So Joan's mother, she finds out about the abuse and she does leave Henry, which is the right thing to do. But she also does the wrong thing when she blames Joan for the abuse. I'm sorry, what, Anna? What is wrong with you? We're gonna see that strained mother-daughter relationships are quite clearly a theme here in Joan's life. After Anna leaves Henry, she enrolls Joan in an all-girls school called St. Agnes. Anna could not afford the tuition, so Joan had to work at the school to be able to pay to go there. She had to do menial chores like dusting and mopping and cleaning toilets. It was just awful. And the other girls looked down on her because of it and teased her, which is just awful. You shouldn't tease people because they're poor. Think about this. So if you're a child in a school and you're teasing someone for being poor, you're a child, what did you do to not be poor? You're not going to work. It's not your money, it's your parents' money. So you really, not that anyone should make fun of anyone at any point. I'm just saying, children can be incredibly mean. Throughout Joan's teenage years, her mother Anna and her had an even, their relationship gets even more strained because Anna has this series of boyfriends and there becomes this pattern where Anna convinces herself herself that Joan, her teenage daughter, is trying to steal her boyfriends, which is not normal and not psychologically sound. It is creepy, and not surprisingly, there is basically zero evidence that a young Joan ever tried to steal any of her mother's boyfriends. Joan did get a reputation while she was at school for being like promiscuous, which is just, you know, so heartening to see that slut shaming has always been a thing. I don't really know why this is made such a big deal of, but you see it everywhere in biographies of Joan, documentaries. People talk about the fact that, oh, she was pretty promiscuous. Who cares who anyone sleeps with? If someone's not sleeping with you or your partner, you probably should not care. Joan does, however, get serious about a boy that she starts dating in 1921. His name is Ray Sterling. He was very kind and encouraging of Joan. He helped encourage her to go to college and to really invest herself in her career. At this time, she really wanted to be a dancer. That was what her focus was on. She wasn't really thinking a lot about acting. She was thinking about dancing. And Ray encouraged her. He encouraged her to enter dance contests, several of which she won, and people began to notice her talent. Joan wanted to marry Ray. Ray was most likely gay, which Joan was probably aware of. So they had this great relationship. It was very mutually beneficial for each other. They cared about each other a lot, and I'm sure they loved each other. It was not romantically sustainable. Joan decided to leave Kansas City and attend Stevens College. She only lasts like one term at Stevens College before she returns to Kansas City and begins working some low-paying jobs. She kept her dreams of being a dancer alive. She kept entering dance contests, but she did stop using the name Billy that she had been using like most of her life, and she began working and performing under her real name, Lucille Lasser. In 1923, Joan starts making some tough decisions that some people have to make to like pay bills. She is filmed dancing nude. This later comes back to haunt her. The video would be played like during peep shows, and it was just something that was like kind of a source of embarrassment for her later in life when people would bring it up or when it would like resurface. And then she moves to Chicago. She's hoping she's gonna have better luck, but she begins dancing at a strip club, and for Joan, this becomes a very slippery slope. She actually ends up arrested that same year for prostitution. Luckily though, she's able to escape this path when she begins working as a chorus girl in Detroit in 1924. While performing in Detroit, Joan is noticed by a Broadway producer named J.J. Schubert. He offers her a job in his latest review called Innocent Eyes, and Joan moves to New York City where she begins to make a name for herself. She becomes a very popular feature in New York gossip magazines because she is often having romantic flings with very wealthy men. It's the 1920s, so obviously it's not a surprise that Joan is basically slut shamed here, but she does not let that get her down. She really enjoys her high-class lifestyle that is being paid for by these men, and Joan would later say that New York City was the first place that actually felt like home to her. Joan is soon scouted by an MGM talent scout, and then he decides, you know what, you're going to Hollywood, Joan. So she gets a contract making about $200 a week with MGM. Getting a contract definitely does not equal stardom though. So for the first year that Joan is in Hollywood, she does like minor bit parts. She doubles for major stars. She poses for publicity stunts. She also like occasionally dances in little small roles, but that is not what ends up getting Joan noticed. Joan realizes, okay, this is not working. I'm not getting as far as I want to. And she decides to start dancing at various Hollywood nightclubs. And she becomes really well known for her sensual personality and her energetic dancing. Joan was incredibly charming. Like, she really knew how to connect with people. This is something that her fans always point out. It really helped her in Hollywood because she forged relationships with some of MGM's big executives. Anytime she was on a movie set, she would make friends with like the cameramen, the producers, any of the technical people. And she was really able to be mentored by these folks because of that. And that really helped her out. People would often say that Joan knew more about the technical aspects of making films than most directors. Joan's ambition pays off, and in 1925, she gets her first role, although it's unbilled, meaning she doesn't even get like a mention in the credits. So she gets her first role in the movie Lady of the Night in 1925. While most of her roles are still small and often uncredited, she does begin to get more of them. Around this time, the MGM execs are like, oh, you know what? We don't really like your name. And in old Hollywood fashion, they come up with like a really super weird idea, which is basically they have this nationwide contest where you can pick Lucille Lesur's new name. The name that wins is Joan Arden, but there was already an actress working in Hollywood with the name Joan Arden. So the studio decides on Joan Crawford, which Joan actually hated at first, but it is now the name that we know her by. In 1926, Joan appeared in the movie Paris, and she grabbed the attention of Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM. He was impressed that she was so charming, she's able to entertain visitors, and so he gives her a new contract for $250 a week. That's almost $4,000 a week in today's money, and this enabled Joan to be able to rent a house and have some financial stability, which she had really not had up until this point. In 1928, Joan finally gets her big break in the silent film Dancing Daughters. This is a silent film about two flappers that are fighting over a millionaire. The movie was a hit, and critics accurately predicted that Joan was going to be an absolute star. Her performance in the film earned her thousands of new fans, and even though Joan wasn't actually the main character in the film, cinemas began putting her name on the marquee because her performance was truly the standout one. Joan's love life was always a huge topic of conversation throughout her life. Every biography mentions the fact that around this time she had countless lovers, boyfriends, and affairs. The most significant one around this time, though, is Douglas Fairbanks Jr. He was Hollywood royalty. He was this really hot teen actor, and he was the son of another famous actor, Douglas Fairbanks Sr. Joan and Douglas began dating seriously at some point between 1927 and 1928. Now, initially, Douglas's parents really did not like that. Although his father would eventually warm up to Joan, his stepmother always hated her. They never made up. Despite the disapproval of Douglas's family, the 24-year-old Joan and 19-year-old Douglas Fairbanks Jr., yes, she was a little bit of a cougar, they married in 1929. By all accounts, the two were madly in love, but Joan actually did end up having several affairs during their courtship and during their marriage. Also in 1929, Joan stars in her first talking movie. This is around the time that we see movies where people actually speak being introduced into theaters, and there were a lot of stars that did not make the transition well. Either they didn't speak English, or they just didn't have a voice that really matched their face. But luckily for Joan, her voice is wonderful. Critics find it to be very alluring, and she begins making the transition successfully from silent film to talking film. While on the outside, the relationship between Joan and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. looked perfect. I mean, they were both beautiful, up-and-coming stars. The marriage proved to be quite a bit of a challenge for both of them. Douglas was frustrated that Joan was so focused on her career, and Joan was frustrated that Douglas's career just didn't seem very committed to it. And to her, she thought, wow, what a waste, because, it probably had to be incredibly frustrating for her to see that he had this built-in advantage. His father was a famous actor, whereas she came from hell in Oklahoma and had to really fight to get where literally she was arrested for prostitution. She really had to work to get where she got. So I can imagine that there was probably a little bit of animosity about seeing Douglas not fully taking advantage of and not fully appreciating the incredible opportunity and privilege that he had in Hollywood. Joan begins to get tired of their marriage, and in 1931, she appears in the film Dance Fools Dance, where she meets Clark Gable. She had incredible on-screen and off-screen chemistry with Clark, and they started a passionate love affair that actually lasted nearly 20 years. On and off, they were meeting back up, strangers in the night, ships passing, and they starred in 8 films together. Even when their affair ended, Joan said that Clark Gable was truly the only man she ever actually loved. They were an iconic film duo in the 1930s, and their movies together were incredibly popular. For the most part, the 1930s were an incredibly successful time for Joan's career. By 1932, she is a bona fide movie star. Her films from 1932 to 1936 were usually in the top 10 of the box office hits, and it was also a very romantic time for her. After divorcing Douglas in 1933, Joan married a leading man named Franchot Tone in 1935. The short-lived marriage ends up being pretty tumultuous. He really envied Joan, and he also was an alcoholic, so that's a really fun combination, a jealous alcoholic. It was was really well known in Hollywood at the time that Joan was being abused. Her makeup artists were having to cover black eyes and bruises. And finally, in 1939, Joan says enough is enough and she leaves French show Tone after she catches him cheating on her, because I guess, you know, the abuse wasn't the final straw. In 1937, Joan was named the Queen of the Movies by Life magazine. Despite this new title, though, in 1937 and 1938, she has really difficult years. She has films that really underperform at the box office. Perhaps it was the fact that they named her Queen of the Movies. It just kind of jinxed her. She ends up being called in an article that is now like infamous box office poison, along with Katharine Hepburn and Fred Astaire. This article wasn't really critical of her acting, but instead it just pointed out the fact that her films were not making a lot of money compared to how big her salary was at the time. The article really upset Joan because, I mean, it was basically saying, you're a great actress, but because your films are not doing as well as, you know, we think they should, you're just overpaid, which I think is just incredibly insulting. After this 2-year slump, Joan makes a comeback in the 1939 film The Women. It was the second highest grossing film of that year, coming in right after Gone with the Wind. Although The Women was a hit and Joan Crawford had been considered a star for years, MGM was really not giving her roles that she felt showcased her talent. And we kind of see this happening in so many beauty biographies where we have these fantastic actresses. I think it really highlights the fact that there were not, and probably still are not, enough roles of real substance for female actors. In 1943, Joan left MGM and signed with Warner Brothers. This was a very risky move at this point in her career, but it proved to be a good move. Her first film with Warner Brothers, Mildred Pierce, was a smash hit and earned her the Oscar for Best Actress in 1945. Joan, who was like so sure she would not win, she didn't even go to the Oscars. She said she had the flu. Everyone's pretty sure she just didn't go because she thought she wasn't going to win. And as soon as she found out that she had won, she quickly had her hair and makeup done and she had a photo shoot of her accepting the Oscar in bed. The photo was plastered on every major magazine the next day, and Joan's success at Warner Brothers would continue for several years. In the 1940s, Joan's personal life gets even more interesting when children enter the picture. Joan had tried unsuccessfully with both Douglas Fairbanks and Franket to have children, but she was never able to carry a pregnancy to term. So the freshly divorced Joan decided to adopt Christina Crawford in 1940 when she was only a year old. She initially named Christina Joan, but she changed her mind and changed it to Christina. And I know you're probably like rolling your eyes right now, like, oh my gosh, she named her baby Joan after herself. But can I just say, my husband has the literal exact same name as his father, and my brother has the literal exact same name as our father, except just like with Junior thrown on it. And I have never heard anyone call my dad or my father-in-law crazy for naming their children after them. I mean, people have called them crazy, but not for that specific reason. Misogyny. Do not internalize it. In 1941, Joan adopts a son named Christopher with her new husband, Philip Terry. She raised Christopher for a year until Christopher's parents decided that they wanted him back, which is devastating. She's raised this child for a year and his biological parents say they want him back. And before you get thinking like, oh, well, that's their right and blah, 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 it is. I understand how adoption works. However, Christopher's biological parents then end up selling him to another couple for $250. Joan forever considered Christopher to be one of her children, and throughout her life when she would talk about her children, she would refer to him as one of her children. I mean, to raise someone for a year, I just can't imagine them being separated from them. It is horrific. In 1943, Joan and Philip adopt another son. They name him Philip Terry Jr. However, after Philip and Joan divorce in 1946, Joan changes his name to Christopher, which, no, Joan, we should not be doing that. Children cannot replace other children. People are irreplaceable. In 1947, Joan adopts twin girls, Kathy and Cynthia, from the Tennessee Children's Home Society. This was actually an unlicensed orphanage, and it turned out to be a really terrible place. It was like a black market adoption ring. The operator, her name was Georgia Tan, she skimmed 90% of the adoption fees to pay for her lavish lifestyle. She was basically like a real life Miss Hannigan from Annie. Even worse, many of the babies in the orphanage were stolen from hospital patients. She would often target like unwed mothers at hospitals and be like, oh, your baby, something's wrong with your baby. baby, we're gonna take him into the next room. And then she'd come back and be like, oh no, your baby died and we've already buried your baby's gone. Like, this is the kind of crap that keeps me up at night. Like, it's horrific and horrifying. I just don't know how anybody survived the 1940s and 50s. In the mid 1940s, Joan develops a drinking problem, which would continue to escalate as the years went on. She would often carry around a 100 proof flask of vodka with her on set, drinking it like it was water, which the thought. Joan would speak very openly about her problems with alcohol as she got older. Her alcoholism severely impacted her ability to parent. In 1952, the seasoned actress left Warner Brothers and decided that she was going to work picture to picture. This is around the time that a lot of actresses were deciding, you know what, I don't want to be told what I'm going to do by a studio anymore. I want to be able to pick my films. And so Joan decides that it's time for her to flee the nest and go out on her own. Unfortunately, she does have trouble finding work. And so Joan realizes, you know what, okay, I'm aging. That's why I'm having a hard time getting as much work as I used to. She starts to think about like a long-term strategic plan for her future. In related news, in 1955, she marries the president of Pepsi, Alfred Steele. Although there was a strategic element to this, to Joan marrying someone that she knew could take care of her if she was no longer working, it is pretty much well thought that she really enjoyed being with Alfred. They had a really good relationship together, and she was very happy to leave Hollywood and move to New York City with him. This happiness is short-lived, and the end of the decade is really difficult for her. Her mother, Anna, passes away, which is very hard on her. Even though they had a strained relationship, that's still her mother, and Joan had always financially supported her mother, Anna. Shortly after Anna dies, Alfred dies suddenly from a heart attack. This just destroys Joan. She's 55, she's sure her career is over, she's lost her husband who was really supporting her, but in 1962, things do turn around a little bit when Joan stars in a film with her longtime rival, Bette Davis. This film, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. The public was immediately really interested in this movie because everybody pretty much knew that Joan and Bette Davis had beef. What kicked it off was that in the 1930s, Bette Davis was getting ready to star in a film called Ex-Lady. And this was going to be like a really big film. But that same day, the New York Times announces that Joan is splitting up from Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Like, they're getting a divorce. And that huge news really overshadowed Bette Davis. In fact, she was supposed to be on the cover or like the front page of the New York Times, and she ended up relegated to like one of the back pages of the paper. So her huge announcement became no news. Bette, in her mind, thought that this was the reason that Ex-Lady had bad ticket sales. I mean, I kind of doubt it, but Bette Davis was pretty sure, and she just kind of stuck with it. Funny enough, you know, you have like these two really strong-willed Aries here, Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. The two really just did not get along. For years, the two had tried to like upstage each other and had disliked each other, but the worst parts of their feud definitely happened on the set of Baby Jane. They often traded barbs, they were very petty and spiteful to each other, and at some points their feud turned physical. During one scene, Davis actually kicked Crawford in the head, causing her to get multiple stitches. Joan, of course, retaliated. In one scene, Davis, who has a bad back, had to carry Joan, and Joan like weighed herself down with weights. Like, I don't know if she put on ankle weights, I don't know what she was doing. She put weights somewhere on her body to make herself heavier, and Bette Davis ends up throwing out her back in that scene. I mean, these are grown women acting like nuts. There's actually a series about this feud called Feud, and I did watch it. I enjoyed it, but I do agree with a lot of Joan Crawford fans who feel like it inaccurately portrayed Joan in some ways. In particular, there's this one scene where Joan is like basically being really rude to a fan asking her for an autograph. Any Joan Crawford fan can tell you that would not happen. Joan loved her fans. She was incredibly charming with them. She was incredibly generous with her time. Like, she went from nothing to like a really lavish life, and she knew it was because people went to see her movies. Like, it's been said that like if you saw her in a grocery store and asked her to sign an autograph, she would do it. Like, she did not care. She 100% was not going to get like cranky because someone asked her for an autograph while she was like just trying to grocery shop. She really cared about her fans and took that responsibility and that privilege very seriously. While she was really lovely to her fans, she was known to be petty and snarky with those she didn't really get along with. Perhaps the most like obvious pettiness she ever displayed was when Bette Davis was nominated nominated for an Oscar for Baby Jane. Joan was not nominated, and Joan could not stand the thought of Betty getting the spotlight. So she called Anne Bancroft, another actress who was nominated, and asked her if she could accept Anne's award on her behalf if she won, because Anne Bancroft was not going to be attending. She was on the East Coast and she couldn't go. So when Anne won Best Actress instead of Betty, Joan accepted the award on Anne's behalf. Like I said, they were both Aries, and it's kind of funny when you think about it, because I think they probably just had like a lot of things in common. And you know, sometimes you just have a lot of things in common with someone and you clash with them. It's almost like they hold up a mirror to you and you kind of pick out the things that you don't like about them that are really things that you don't like about yourself. Baby Jane was the last major film that Joan made. In the 1970s, she did little film work, but she did appear in several television shows as well as making like public appearances. And her health did begin to decline. At one point, she required around-the-clock care for like a very painful periodontal disease, which I didn't even know that like that's your gums and teeth bones, I guess. I mean, that sounds horrible because how would you eat? It was also at this time that Joan became a Christian Scientist, which please do not confuse that with Scientology. They are not the same. In May of 1977, Joan knew that she was coming to the end of her life. On May 6th, she gave her beloved Shih Tzu away because she was too weak to care for her anymore. And then on May 10th, Joan Crawford passed away in New York City of cardiac arrest. She was probably around 70 years old. Again, we don't know for sure because she did often kind of change her birth year away. When she passed, she quite famously left her two oldest children, Christina and Christopher, out of her will for reasons that, quote, they knew. Joan's life was nothing if not scandalous, but perhaps the biggest scandal of her life actually occurred after her death. In 1978, Joan's daughter, Christina Crawford, wrote her memoir, Mommie Dearest. I used to think Mommie Dearest was like hilarious until I did this beauty biography, and now I'm just like horrified because this movie was an instant sensation, and in 1981 they made it into a hit movie with Faye Dunaway. The accusations that Christina made about Joan pretty much overnight almost erased the entire legacy that Joan had built. She claimed that Joan viciously beat her. She claimed that she sometimes choked her. She claimed that one night she dragged her out of bed screaming, "No wire hangers," something that's like probably like the best known scene of that movie, Mommie Dearest. She claimed that Joan had shredded her favorite dress and then made her wear it for a week just to humiliate her. She said that Joan starved her and her siblings. She said that Joan would tie Christopher to the bed at night. It was just a horrific account. Joan also quite subtly hints that maybe Joan killed her husband, Alfred Steele, you know, the Pepsi president. Now, Joan actually knew when she was like in the last years of her life, she knew that Christina was going to be writing a book. Like she knew it was happening. And she told her friends that she thought Christina was likely going to put a lot of lies and fabrications in there, and that she was pretty sure that Christina was just trying to make money off of her name. Two of Joan's other children, her twins, and many of Joan's friends and her coworkers, even her nemesis, Bette Davis, all said the book had a lot of lies and a lot of exaggerations. Joan's secretary of 50 years said that yes, Joan was strict and sometimes she was misguided in how she raised her children, but she never abused her children. Joan was definitely a controlling perfectionist, and she definitely was an alcoholic. But the book has a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of contradictions, and it's kind of difficult to believe, especially based on the fact that, you know, two of her children have such a different account, as do so many people that were close to her, ones that liked her and ones that didn't. It's just really hard to believe that Joan was the monster that Mommie Dearest made her out to be. I hope that we can all begin to see Joan as more than just one exaggerated depiction of her. For all of her faults, she was also a human who managed to take a very tough life and make something pretty incredible out of it. When you think about it, the fact that she achieved such success and then society was more than willing to throw it away based on one person's account, one book, it's pretty sad. If you enjoyed this episode of Beauty Biography, be sure to check out the entire playlist and let me know in the comments below who you'd like to see in the next episode. I hope to see you then, and until then, you take care of yourself. Bye.